mysteries? Well, there's only two ways you can do it if they're in heaven. You're either going to have to go up and see them, or someone's going to have to come down and tell you. And that's what happens in apocalyptic texts. Either some sort of heavenly revealer, like an angel figure, comes down and discloses what the secrets are, or the seer, someone like John, the prophet, in a vision, ascends to the heavenly realm and is shown the secrets, the mysteries that are in heaven. So it's all about disclosing, revealing heavenly mysteries. That's how the book begins. The apocalypse is the unveiling, the disclosure of heavenly mysteries. And in Revelation, both of those things happen. You may remember you've got in chapter 4, we'll look at in the afternoon, John, the seer, ascends to the heavenly realm in a vision. So we can see the mysteries that are happening there, the secrets are shown to him. And later in chapter 10, an angel comes down and discloses things. So both of those things happen in the book of Revelation. But that's all an apocalypse is. It's this idea of a text that discloses heavenly secrets or heavenly mysteries. And there's different ways that happens in different texts. So that's really what Collins's definition was talking about. They're a type of prophetic text, but where there's a really strong emphasis on mysteries or secrets of God that you can only know about if they're revealed to you. You can't know them otherwise. Is that all right? Is that taking a bit of the mystery out of what is an apocalypse? So this was it written down. So the books which are kind of placed in the category of apocalypse, and the term apocalypse, although it's used as the first word in the book of Revelation, as a category to kind of describe books, in terms of if you were a librarian, you think, let's put them in the apocalypse category, it's a modern scholarly term. We've just called other books that are like the book of Revelation apocalypse. There's no one in the ancient world used that term to describe books, they just would refer to them as a type of prophecy. But that's what sets these types of texts apart, is this kind of secrets, there's heavenly mysteries, which you can only know about if they're disclosed to you. And so you either go up and see them, or someone comes down and tells you. So that's the sort of thing that happens in the apocalypse. So it's not all about the end of the world, you see. This is where people go a bit wrong. Because in our kind of contemporary understanding, what is an apocalypse is this kind of end time, whatever. An apocalypse isn't necessarily about the end time, it's just about mysteries or secrets that are revealed. And sometimes the mysteries are about the end time, but not always. Sometimes they're about what's going on in heaven, sometimes they're about where the righteous will live in the future. They're not always about the end of the world. They're just secrets or mysteries that are disclosed. It's just in our text, often they're talking about that sort of thing, but that's not the only type of secret there's going to be. So is that all right so far in terms of prophecy, apocalypse, letter? The main thing, the book of Revelation is like a prophecy. It's like Isaiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Zechariah. Read those texts, and then read Revelation, and you'll get loads of insights into it, because you'll see, oh wow, it's picking up that horses from Zechariah, it's picking up the temple from Ezekiel. You'll see the text in a new way. You'll see layers of richness you wouldn't have noticed otherwise. Because the audience who originally heard this text knew those scriptures. They knew those images already. So is that okay so far? Excellent. So that's the idea of kind of apocalypse or a prophecy. Then a little bit about the context. So who wrote it? Who was it written to? When was it written? There's always lots of fights about these things. So the historical context, first of all, the author. So we know from the text, although the writer doesn't refer to himself as a prophet, he talks about this text as a prophecy. So it's very clear that he's essentially a prophet or a visionary, kind of mystic figure, referred to himself as John, and that he was on the island of Patmos. So he's an early Christian prophet. From the earliest tradition, from 2nd century onwards, he's been identified as the author of the Gospel of John, and 1, 2, and 3 John, the letters, the epistles of John. Like anything in scholarship, all these things get debated, but it's just, that's the main thing to know. He's absolutely an early Christian prophet who was on the island of Patmos, possibly exiled there because he got in trouble for preaching. We're not 100% certain. And he may well be the author also of the Gospel of John and the epistles 1, 2, 3 John. It's a debated issue, and I don't want to sidetrack us with that sort of thing. It's not the most important thing. But if you are interested, there's an absolutely wonderful book by Culpeper called John, the Son of Zebedee, The Life of a Legend. And what he does is he works his way through the Synoptic Gospels, the Gospel of John, the Apocalypse, and then on through the 2nd, 3rd centuries, through art, and just looks at the figure of John and what do we know about John from Scripture. And it's wonderful, really opens up this idea of the authorship in a much kind of fresher and richer way. So if you are interested in that kind of historical context and the author in more detail, rather than these kind of arguments, did John write it or didn't he write it? Read a book like Culpeper and you just see the richness of the tradition, linking this with the Johannine type of text, these other Gospels and letters of John. And certainly there's very close affinities between the Book of Revelation and other Pauline texts and Johannine texts, because it's written in that same kind of world, Asia Minor, the 1st century. So if you are interested, do have a look at that book by Culpeper. It's a wonderful book on John. Who was the text written to? This is probably the bit everyone knows. The letters to the 7 churches in chapters 2 and 3 of the Book of Revelation. You've got these 7 different cities in what is now kind of Roman Asia Minor, Turkey, now kind of world. And if you see the order in which the different cities are referred to in chapters 2 and 3, are the order you'd have got to them if you went from Patmos and you were delivering the letter, which is quite nice to see. So there's 7 cities referred to in Revelation 2 to 3. 5 of them in the district of Lydia. The order in which they're listed follows the route which a person would have took if they were delivering the letters to each of those cities, commencing from Ephesus. And so you've got these kind of 7 cities in Roman Asia Minor. And so what that does, I'll just show you another map. So you can see in terms of where they are, most of them in the kind of district of Lydia, but all around that kind of Roman Asia Minor, 7 different cities they're written to. So why these 7 cities? That's always a tricky question, because they weren't the only cities in that area that had early Christian communities. And so it's understood in different types of ways. But 2 things that can affect how you read the text will be if you're thinking about the audience, who is it written to? One is reading in the 1st century context. Thinking, okay, if we know more about those communities, that will help us understand the text. And what it does do is when you get this question of what was the kind of context this letter, these kind of Book of Revelation was written to these various communities? Well, there isn't one context, there's 7 contexts. So it's complex, it's richer than you might say. Because you'll often see scholars, and I'll refer to it myself later, that these texts were written to communities suffering persecution. But if you look at the letters, some of them were, but not all of them were. So even saying something like that, it's a little bit more complex than that. There were 7 cities, and they each had problems and difficulties of their own, and they weren't all the same difficulties and problems. So this is Stephen Freeson, who talks about this idea of Revelation's written to at least 7 different contexts, not just one. And so you get, it's all, in terms of the new GDPR regulations, they'll be getting in very bad trouble, because they've written the letters to all 7 and everyone can read everyone else's. So that seems to be part of the thing, you're getting told off in front of everyone else. And so you get, some of them get told off, some of them get praised, and some of them get a bit of a mix of the 2. So which assemblies, which churches get the most praise? Smyrna and Philadelphia. Who gets in most trouble? Sardis and Laodicea. And then the others in the middle get a little bit of praise and a little bit of blame as to what they're doing. And so there's been various studies from a kind of social, historical context. Is it at least partly related to the kind of wealth and status of these cities? Because the cities, Smyrna and Philadelphia, who get the most praise, may have been the most economically poor. They may have been the most open to the message of John's text, because it's a hard-line message. The reason why the Book of Revelation appeals particularly to fundamentalists is it's quite a fundamentalist text. It's quite a hard-line text. Because one of the things it's going to say again and again and again is no compromise. You have to proclaim the kind of testimony of Jesus, and you can't compromise with the empire, you can't compromise with anything else. And if that means you've got to suffer persecution and die, so be it. You've got to stick with it. And that's a very hard message for people to accept. And Smyrna and Philadelphia are praised because they do accept that. They are suffering persecution and they're sticking with it. Whereas some of the others, they're trying to compromise a little bit and they get in trouble. But Smyrna and Philadelphia, as it says, so there may be things going on with the social status, economic status of those who are getting praised. Laodicea in particular seems to be getting in trouble, being slightly higher social status, maybe trying to compromise a little bit more from the author's perspective. The other thing that happens, so one is you can get kind of a real richness into the text if you look at each of those letters to the 7 churches and see who's it written to, what they're getting in trouble for, what they're getting praised for, and gain some real insights into that in a 1st century context. But we don't live in the 1st century. And this is the same issue that arose in relation to Paul's letters. this whole issue from the very early on, first, second centuries. Do we need to read Paul's letters? He was writing to Corinth or Rome or these places. I mean, that's thousands of years ago. How is it relevant to us now? And so there's always this question of how, is there kind of something universal? Is there something that still speaks to us now through these scriptural texts? And what happened both for Paul's letters and in the book of Revelation is this idea of the number 7, this idea of completeness or wholeness. Is there something about writing to 7 churches that you're trying to give a sense of a whole? That what you're saying in these texts can speak to all the church at any time, because it's different types of response that you're getting. So you can see from, I just put up another quote from Ian Boxall from his commentary on Revelation. Ian notes that many commentators in the history of interpretation of Revelation 2 to 3 have interpreted the letters to the 7 churches as having a universal significance. So this happened with Paul's letters. The earliest collections of Paul's letters started putting them into letters to 7 different communities. They're universal. They're not just for Rome or Corinth back in the first century, they're for everyone. Similarly, the book of Revelation, there's letters to 7 communities because it's giving you something about the universal church, the church for all time. And what it's saying to these groups and the failings and mistakes they're making will continue to have relevance. So over these 2 chapters, with their juxtaposition of comfort and challenge, rebuke and encouragement, one can find every state of the church and every conceivable type of Christian addressed. And this will happen right the way through the patristic and medieval era, is they'll look at these 7 churches as types. They won't be so worried about what was going on in Laodicea in the first century, but what type of faith response is this particular community representing, and how is that relevant to us now? Looking at these 7 different types. And this is Victorinus. I'll refer to him again later. It's the earliest extant commentary we've got on Revelation from the 3rd century. He's from what's now Slovenia. And he looked at each of those 7 and described them as different types, different kind of faith types. Some more positive than others. So this idea of who's this letter written to? On one hand, you can really get involved with the historical context, the social context of Laodicea and these other cities. In another way, you can also look at how these types, how is this kind of universally relevant? How is it relevant to us now, even if we're not living back in the 1st century? Is there something about what he's saying in terms of praise or blame that we can take on board for how we're living, how we're compromising, how we're not doing what we should be doing? So is that okay in terms of the context? Because the historical context is always fascinating. There's loads of lovely books written on that. But remembering also we don't live in the 1st century, so how is this text still of enduring kind of relevance to us? So when was the text written? I usually try and fudge this one because there's loads of fights about. So I usually try and say late 1st century and hope no one notices. There's a lot of fight as to which emperor was the kind of dating of this book. Still, I would say there's a slight majority of commentators would date it to the late 1st century, around about the 90s, during the reign of Domitian, whereas a slight minority of commentators, occasionally on the rise, they would situate it earlier, probably late 60s, early 70s, immediately after Nero's death, during the period of the Judean revolt against Rome. And one of my lecturers at Heathrow, Bridget, good for an update, she always had the best question. It was the so what question. Was always what she used to ask me. So what? What difference does it make? What difference does it make if it was Nero or if it was Domitian? So that's always important to think about, rather than always worrying, can we pin it down to the kind of exact week when this text was written? What difference does it make if we know? And the key thing, whether it's Domitian or Nero, at least part of what was going on in various ways was kind of the kind of imperial state persecuting kind of Christians. So even though it was mainly in Rome rather than necessarily in Asia Minor, they may be more localised in Asia Minor, there's something about the context of these texts talking about external threat or hostility. And that's kind of as important, as it is known which exact emperor we're talking about. That was my way of fudging out of that question. You noticed that already. So the Apocalypse is addressed to 7 communities in Rome and Asia Minor: Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. At least some of whom were experiencing a period of distress or persecution instigated by external forces of local civic or political powers. Because you'll get, particularly in Rome, during those periods, you were getting a lot of kind of persecution of Christians, particularly Nero, around the time of Nero. But further out in the empire, it wasn't always so top down, it might be more localised kind of opposition with people round about you. And also you would get kind of disputes with other Jews in the local synagogues. You see again that coming through in Revelation 2 to 3. This idea of external opposition or hostility or threat. And one of the things the book of Revelation does, and a lot of theologians pick this up almost as like a political theology, is it's very hostile towards empire, this kind of overarching empire. But essentially you've got two empires or two emperors going on. You've got God and you've got the Roman emperor, and there's only one who should be worshipped. So the apocalypse unmarks the imperial power as oppressive, diabolical and idolatrous. So he's absolutely uncompromising in his critique of Rome, because he sees what Rome is doing. Just remember, they would deify the emperor. When the emperor died, they would be seen as a god to be worshipped. There was an imperial cult where you would worship the emperors in temples. And he saw this as absolute idolatry. There is one God and one God alone to be worshipped, and it isn't Nero, and it isn't any of these other gods. And so they're seen as kind of usurping the role of the creator God by setting themselves up as ruling the world through the empire, by being worthy of worship. Absolute idolatry. And he's scathing, absolutely scathing about Rome and other imperial powers. In this text, there's only one ruler of the world, and that's the creator. The other thing that Revelation does, as I said, I mentioned it in relation to the letters, is this very, very hard line. Even unlike some of Paul's letters, where he can be a little bit more towards compromise and thinking through alternatives, Revelation is really very black and white. You absolutely don't compromise with the empire in any way. It's idolatrous, it's diabolical, you worship God alone, you have nothing to do with the empire. And what that can mean, if you take that stance as an early Christian, is you might die. Because if you're going to worship God alone and you're not worshipping the other gods, in time this will be seen as being kind of atheist. That what you're doing is not worshipping the gods of the city, and you're going to get persecuted and killed. And the apocalypse says, so be it. You've got to, that's what you have to do. This is what Christ did, and you've got to imitate Christ. And if you have to witness to the point of death, so be it. This is a very, very strong, very harsh text, kind of an exhortation to martyrdom, that what you have to do is witness even to the point of death. You don't give in. It's not about being violent in any way, but it's you yourself may suffer violence by your testimony that you give. The apocalypse is an exhortation to martyrdom. That's stealing a line from Origin. The audience are urged to bear the testimony or prophecy of Jesus, even if that entails opposition, mistreatment and death. And if you go back to the letters in 2 to 3, the communities that are praised most highly are those who are willing to do that. Even if they're experiencing oppression and difficulties, they're not giving up, they're not walking away, they're sticking with it. So it's a very strong and hard text. And as I said, it's one